We're then going to have our start method, and inside of the start method, we're going to construct an object of the rectangle class. So we're going to do that in this very first line of the start method. From there, I'm going to configure two different labels and text fields, one to be able to specify a height, and the other to be able to specify the width for a rectangle object. One of the things to keep in mind is in the rectangle class itself, we had set length, so we're going to associate the length with the height, and then we'll have the width correspond to the width. Okay, so I'll have all that. Also make sure that we align these H boxes to the center, so we're going to make sure that the label and the text field inside of them is centered. We're also going to be using a little bit of padding on the first H box to make sure that it's offset slightly from the very top edge of the application window. From there, we're also going to create a button that we click, and when we click this button, it's going to take the values that we specify in these two text fields and then use that to kind of construct the rectangle. So that rectangle is going to get constructed through this output label. This will initially be empty, and then when we click the button, we're going to have this event handler for it. And in this event handler, we're going to do a couple of things. The first thing I want to go ahead and do is check each of these two text fields to make sure that they both have a value in them. If either one of them happens to be empty, we'll go ahead and just do nothing. In addition to this, there's some additional error checking that you could do for this, such as checking to make sure that the value that's put into there is actually a number. If the user types in some extra characters, non-numeric characters, then obviously that'll also cause some problems. So there's additional error checking you could include to cover that as well. But for now, we'll just go ahead and include it for a fairly simple check, just checking to make sure that they both have some value in them at least. And as long as that's true, then we'll go ahead and take those two values, the height and the width, and we're going to get the text from those text fields. That'll be a string. We'll parse that to a double, and then we're going to use the set length and set width methods of our rectangle class to go ahead and get those values and go ahead and set those the fields of the rectangle class. The next thing I'll go ahead and do is to set the text of the output label. So I'm going to go ahead and set it so that it just shows that the height is equal to whatever value is put for the length, and then the width is going to be equal to whatever value is put, the width is equal to whatever value is put for the width. Okay. And then the next part, I'm going to do two things here. The first I'll mention right here at the bottom is create a border around the label. And in addition to that, I'm also going to go ahead and set some padding. So the way this is going to work is that essentially the border that I create around the label is going to be kind of like the rectangle, visually, the rectangle that I'm constructing. Obviously, the dimensions for this will be a little bit off because I need to make sure that that border is at least large enough to fit around the text. But to some degree, it'll kind of match up with the dimensions. And the way that I'm going to make sure that this matches up with the dimensions is that I'm going to get the length and the width, and I'm going to divide these by 2 for each one of the 4 areas, the top, left, bottom, and right of the padding around the label. So the reason I'm dividing by 2 is because we need to make sure that, if we're talking about the height of it, half of that corresponds to the top padding, and then the other half corresponds to the bottom padding, and then for the width, half corresponds to the left, and then the other half corresponds to the right. So we'll make sure that everything kind of matches up appropriately. Okay, so that's going to be what happens whenever we click the button. And then finally down here at the bottom, I'm going to create a VBox. I'm going to call this VBox root, since this is going to correspond to the root node for the scene of this application. I'm giving it 10 pixels of spacing between each one of the different elements that I put into this VBox. So we're going to have our 2 H boxes for the height and width. We're then going to have that make rectangle button, and then at the very bottom we'll have the output label for our visual for our rectangle. And then I'll go ahead and set the alignment for the root to be top center. The reason I'm going to do top center is because I want all of the content to be kind of positioned towards the top of the application window. That way then there's going to be enough room in that bottom area for various sizes of rectangles that we could construct. And then we'll go ahead and set the scene using that VBox as the root node, making the dimensions of this 500 by 500. We'll make the title of this, Rectangle Gallery, so it kind of just matches up with the name of it. And then we'll go ahead and display the stage, so we'll display the application window. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run this, take a look at how it actually works. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this. So make sure that we compile both the rectangle and the rectangle gallery files. And then I'll go ahead and run it. So I just need to run the rectangle gallery since that has the main method inside of it. Okay, so we've got our application window right here. We've got our two labels with our two text fields, and then our create the rectangle button underneath it. So to start off with, I'll give this some fairly small dimensions. So I'll start with just something like a 1 by 1, and then I'll create the rectangle. So we can now see that we've got our height and width, and you can see a very small amount of padding around it. You'll notice that the edge of this border just barely doesn't touch the text inside. And then as we continue to increase the dimensions of this, say maybe I move this up to something like 10 by 10, click create, we see that it got a little bit larger, and we can continue to make this even bigger. And the larger we make this, as we change these two values, the larger the rectangle, or our pseudo-rectangle with that border gets. And then we can continue to increase this more and more. So maybe we go all the way up to 100 by 100 and get a pretty reasonably sized rectangle right there. Okay, so this will be a pretty good example of how we might go about creating our own custom class and actually being able to use that inside of a JavaFX application, so that you have a pretty good idea as to, in terms of GUIs, a pretty useful use case for a custom class. And obviously, if you continue to build on this with more and more complex programs, you could start introducing multiple custom classes into a single application.